What's going on, guys? Aarava here. Welcome back to my Let's Talk F1 2017 series, the series where I take a look at the F1 cars at launch and try to give you some aerodynamic insights into the car and also give you my opinions on the car. Obviously, for this one, it's the Renault RS17 that just launched earlier today, so do let me know in the comments below what you think of the look of the car, aesthetically, you know, the livery and everything like that. I personally kind of like it. I mean, it's a little bit odd, the kind of yellow to black transition, but for the majority part, I think it works quite nice. And what I really like about the car is more the kind of aerodynamic kind of parts of the car. There's some really interesting parts of this car which obviously weren't there last year. Last year, Renault's car, they admitted themselves, was pretty much Lotus's 2015 car, adapted a little bit and changed somewhat, but really it was literally the Lotus 2015 car. This is the first car that they mentioned this in the live stream as well, the very first car they've kind of, you know, properly built as Renault and not just the Enstone team, so they've finally been able to really get their influence on the fundamental package they're working with, because, you know, once you've got that fundamental basis, yeah, you can add some things, you can change some things around with winglets and stuff like that, but really the fundamental shape of the car is already determined, and that was the case last season for Renault. But this year, obviously, their first real attempt at the F1 car, and quite exciting year for them to have that first attempt for the 2017 regulations. Of course, you can see the usual 2017, characteristics, the front wing, the rear wing, you know, widening, that tapered front wing, all that stuff I've kind of said in my video from yesterday. If you did miss that for the Sauber video, do go check it out. There'll be a card annotation in the top right. You can go check out my Sauber analysis. I may repeat a few points from the Sauber analysis because there are kind of, you know, similarities, obviously, as there would be. Things like the shark fin, which I'll get back to later. But let's get into the more specific Renault-specific details of this car. So if we're taking a look at the front end, the first sort of thing you might notice just above the 27 is that kind of light shadow, and that is an S-duct on the Renault. So a lot of teams are going for S-ducts probably this year. Sauber did not, surprisingly, or not really that surprising, to be honest. It's Sauber, but they didn't go for an S-duct. Renault have gone for an S-duct. We've seen before Force India, Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren. They've all gone for S-ducts. We'll probably see quite a few other teams go for S-ducts. It's just it's like a fashion trend almost in F1 cars, but, you know, it's not really just aesthetics, it's actual aerodynamic benefit for making the flow attach on the above side of the chassis. I'll get back to that later because there's a better shot of the car on the sideways view where you can actually see where the inlet is to the S-duct, but just confirmation there, they do have an S-duct indeed. And you can see I've outlined in red on the right hand side the huge barge board that you'll now see on most 2017 cars. Renault's is quite peculiar, really, because they've gone for quite a chunky part of their barge board right at the front, and you'll see from overhead shots that area is quite, you know, utilized quite well by Renault, and, you know, the box constraint that they can work in is so much larger, so why not exploit it as much as you can? And Renault have come out of the box with quite an aggressive looking barge board and kind of actual array they've got going on that setup. If you go and pay attention to the actual roll hoop kind of engine inlet, you can see there's 4 different inlets. I think there may be even a 5th one just underneath it, but there's 4 main inlets there. You can see the kind of 2, I've numbered it 2 and 3 in the very central part. I'm guessing that will be to the main actual combustion chamber, and then I'm guessing 1 and 4 maybe for other parts of the engine, although engines and stuff like that is not my expertise or kind of in my knowledge kind of realm, so I'm not too sure exactly about that, but there are 4 different inlets. It's been a big trend of at least having 2. We've seen the cars like Toro Rosso have 3. Mercedes had a huge inlet for 2 different inlets to split the air where it's going. Renault have opted for 4, so maybe that's potentially what Red Bull and Christian Horner have been harking about the new Renault engine for this season, that they made a big step forward. Perhaps we'll be seeing all Renault-powered cars with, you know, maybe multiple, at least 3 inlets, perhaps, if they've changed the architecture around a little bit, or think that you can gain some performance that way, or it may just be a factory thing. Maybe, obviously, Renault being the factory team of their own engine, they can have some more insight compared to Red Bull, perhaps, of how to maybe best cool the engine, so maybe they've gone for that for that reason. I've also just noted, if you watched my Sauber video, I noted at the top of the side pod, it was very, very plain, and this is exactly what I was talking about when you go to higher up teams, or generally as you go higher up, more teams use more complex ways to affect the flow on the very top of the side pod. Renault being one of them here, you can see I've kind of noted out, you've got 1 winglet coming off the actual monocoque structure or chassis structure where the driver would sit, and then you've got about 3, I think there's a small one tucked away, but two visible ones you can see. I think there's a 3rd one tucked away there. Vortex Generators, which is just little uprights on the top of the side pod. And as I mentioned last time out, and essentially what these Vortex Generators are doing on the top of the side pod is when any air meets it, it's going to encourage mixing of the flow behind it. And so that will help energize the flow going over the side pod, help it stay attached to the top of the side pod. And obviously the side pod then curves inwards towards the diffuser. So they're trying to make the diffuser work a lot more efficiently. On the front wing for the Renault, unlike the Sauber, Renault have finally got this sort of pattern that we've seen a lot of the time now with the top teams. Mercedes were the first ones to really introduce this very different concept of how to make the edge of the front wing. Then Ferrari copied it. I believe Red Bull don't exactly fully copy the same exact style, but they've got the same sort of pattern going on. Essentially, it's this kind of arcing tunnel sort of section of the edge of the front wing, and it turns the front wing into not only a downforce creating device, but also a flow control device, because this tunnel of different, arcing flaps basically tries to force the air to go towards where I pointed it with the arrows and the circles, trying to get the air there to clean up the wake coming off the sidewall, coming off the actual back end of the tire, because as you'll see when we go on to a later picture, what is actually going on there with behind the tire wake. But it's nice to see Renault following that pattern of that kind of archway on the front wing. It's kind of, again, like the S-duct, almost like a trend that most teams start to follow. A lot of the time you'll see in Formula 1, a lot of the top teams will do something, and then, bottom teams will eventually get the resources to copy, or sometimes the bottom team might find a breakthrough, and then the top teams basically just nick the idea and just copy it and make it better generally. But, these sort of things are becoming mainstream now in F1 in terms of the actual front wing design. I've got another front shot here, pretty much the same sort of thing. I've kind of noted out the different Vortex Generator on the top of the side pod. You can also see coming off the upright, they've got this nice kind of L and then kind of dog leg shape coming and connecting. That's how the upright connects to the side pod. So that in itself will also affect the flow. And also, I've just noted on the right, just the amount of gap they've left, just like Sauber and like every team pretty much is going to probably be doing. They're actually leaving quite a lot of space between the allocated width of what you can do and how much their side pod actually goes up to, because obviously they want to make it nice and tight, because the tighter Coke bottle shape you have of that entire side pod area, the better flow you're going to get curling around towards that diffuser. But at the same time, obviously, they need to meet the kind of width requirement they need for the floor, so they've just got this huge gap, which is quite a nice chunky bit of space where all the flow can kind of go through, especially with that huge barge board. That's going to make a huge effect, having that huge barge board to affect that flow. And also I just kind of cropped the front wing on the left, made it a little bit brighter so you can see the actual complexity of that Renault front wing. If you compare it to Renault of last year at the very beginning where testing was, you can see the kind of development path they've made, and it's really nice to see that finally, just generally, if you just took one look at it, you can clearly see it's a lot more complex than last year's car, and finally, the Renault team can actually have a bit of an influence rather than it all just being a hand-me-down from Enstone. So if we go to the side view of the car, now it may look a little bit strange on the edges. That's because I've actually brightened it up because it was quite a dark photo. But if you do brighten it up, you can clearly see where the inlet is for the S-duct. I've colored it in green there, so it's just a little cutout there underneath where the camera, the FOM camera housing sits. And I've put in blue the arrow, effectively roughly what the air is going to be doing in the duct. So it's called the S-duct because it's an S-shaped duct. So it takes air from that side or below of the car, brings it to the top of the chassis, and that air is smoothly put over the top of the chassis, kind of going towards where the driver's steering wheel and head is. And essentially introducing that air, kind of injection of air, will help encourage more mixing. It'll encourage the air to stay attached above that entire section of the flow and try and, just basically keep it going towards the back end. So different angle, but there it is. So there's the nose cone, and you can see very clearly on the right hand side a very weird cutout of that kind of side part of the nose that's kind of attaching to the front wing. The very front attaches to the front wing, and then you've got this extension that basically hangs up above the ground going backwards. And essentially they're trying to get as much air channeling underneath there, because the underneath the car is very, very important. A lot of aerodynamics go underneath the car, which you don't actually see when the car is running, but that's a great way to get a lot of air around the car, underneath the car as well. And so they'll have, higher teams will have a plethora of different winglets underneath the car. So that kind of whole extending back area is just trying to get the air that way. basically backwards. But I reminisce it to Red Bull's sort of 2016 design, because if you just look on the edge, it sort of curves in on itself. It's got like a little indent that's very, very similar to the Red Bull car. So I feel like they've got a little bit of a kind of inspiration from that sort of design. If we move on to the side area, in that previous picture, I did circle the end plate for a reason, and the reason is in the launch pictures they don't have it, but on the actual in-person, real life car presentation, the Renault side uprights had 3 strakes on them. They're not in the computer-generated pictures. I'm guessing this computer-generated picture is completely simplified. There's a lot of different simplifications, like also the floor. But on launch, they had 3 strakes on the actual upright. Also, the upright itself is very interesting. From the side view now, you can clearly see it's got this kind of weird kind of dog leg upside down L shape connecting to the floor then. Very, very peculiar kind of shape, really. Not really seen too much like it ever before. But I've just circled the entire area of that barge board and the upright, because you can just see how much more freedom teams have in this area now to design stuff. That dog leg shape wouldn't have been there before. Generally, it's usually just straight down, but because they can affect that area a lot more, they've extended the floor a bit further. They've got the huge barge board that I mentioned. You've got this huge, just above the SMP Racing logo, there's just a huge chunky part of the barge board, unlike the Sauber, where it was more like a typical barge board, but just scaled up. But now Renault have got this kind of square-like structure at the very front, and also a tiny, interesting little winglet as well, just ahead of the barge board that I've circled in that smaller circle on the left of the barge board. So just a small little winglet, again, affecting the flow just as it enters that area of the barge board and then wraps around towards the side pod. The 3 streaks on the upright next to the side pods, not actually 100% sure what they're going for there. It could be drag reduction a tiny bit in terms of the air can just pass through, but if they've curved the slot gaps enough, it may be enough to basically encourage the flow to kind of go through the gap a little bit faster. It kind of energizes the flow a little bit more and keeps everything attached on that kind of streamline, if you will. Also, noting on the shark fin, I will say that is a huge exaggeration of the flow off a shark fin. I just exaggerated it just to get my point across of what they're trying to do with the shark fin. It's probably not that dramatic in reality in terms of the vortex coming off the tip, but they're essentially trying to concentrate the vortex, I think, and trying to basically get as much air away from the rear wing, turbulent air away from the rear wing, and trying to clean it up so it works a lot more efficiently. Also, I didn't mention it in yesterday's video, in the Sauber video. Another reason for a shark fin can also be, if you're talking about downforce, that's obviously up and down force, but there's also side force. When the car is cornering, obviously there's some sideways action the car can go, and for stability's sake, the shark fin can be used to help stabilize the car, because if you're thinking about the flow entering diagonally or straight on to the shark fin, it wouldn't ever go straight on to the shark fin. It always usually be diagonally, obviously, if the car's turning a left or right corner. But let's just say it's going directly onto the shark fin, perpendicular to it. It basically acts like a, fake sort of wing, essentially, like that. If the flow's hitting it on like that, it's like a sideways wing that helps stabilize the car. But in F1 terms, that's probably not the main goal. It's more just cleaning up the flow over the rear wing. But in other categories of motorsport, a shark fin may be used more for that purpose, to kind of help the sideways force. And then I've just noticed some details on the front wing, little winglet on the end plate, kind of standard stuff from most F1 teams now. They'll have a few winglets, they'll have kind of slots in the end plate as well, basically just to kind of separate the flow into different regions they want and also affect it even more. Obviously, the little wing will chuck up the air even more to this region where, if we move on to the overhead shot of the car, is exactly where they want it. So I'm going to explain what I've kind of drawn. You'll see some weird squiggles behind the wheel, and this is actually knowledge from my dissertation work, so it's kind of interesting for me to talk about it. But essentially, off the car, at the very top of the wheel, especially the wake, you get these arch-shaped vortexes that get spun around. So every single wing you'll see now is trying to get flow around to that region to smoothen it up. You'll have, obviously, air going to the inside of the tire, and that's going to the brake duct, that's going through to the suspension parts, that's going through the winglets underneath the car, and also to the barge board. But then on the outer region, all of the cascades, all of the kind of curling tunnels you're seeing, is all to get flow to that point of behind the tire to try and clean that up, to try and clean up these vortexes, because you can imagine all these turbulent vortexes coming through down towards the side pod is not going to be as effective if it was smoothened up a bit by all this flow off the front wing. Also, from this view, you can just see the larger area of the barge board and the vortex generator part. I've noted on the top side, on the top of the car on the left hand side. You can also see the little floor detailings. Again, probably simplified for the computer generated version. It definitely probably looks a little bit more complicated on the actual launch spec and what we'll see in testing. And then I've also noted that little area I talked about between the rear tire and the rear wing. This little slot between there, you'll see winglets kind of lining up around where the suspension meets the wheel. But that little area between the wing and the rear tire, they're trying to create like a vacuum seal to make the diffuser work a lot better. Because if there's more air being introduced on the side on the side of the diffuser, it's not going to work as efficiently because you'll get air escaping across on the sides. So to kind of create a vacuum seal, they'll try and squirt air towards that area. And then finally, also from this view, obviously you can see the S-Duct just on the top of the 27, and you can just see the general 2017 design parameters. The tapered front wing, it looks a little bit wider as well to go with the wider tires, and you can see the kind of kink shape and the shallower shape of the rear wing, because you can see a lot more of the end plate from the top view before you actually get the actual main plane on the rear wing. And then finally we get to the rear end of this car, and oh my fucking god, the rear tires. Huge rear tires. This picture really does it some great justice on how really chunky those new rear tires are. But you can see also something we didn't see in the Sauber video yesterday, the bigger diffuser all cars can now run, and you can just see the difference. If you compare this to pictures of last year's cars, just a huge area more the diffuser is going to get to work with, and you've got the usual sort of characteristics from last year as well on the rear wing end plate, these strakes that go and kind of nearly almost touch towards the diffuser, and that will basically send air from the top downwards to the diffuser to help it work through. And then something I sort of noted with the dotted line towards the engine cover is just the difference between some of the teams on how better they can package the car. If we compare it to probably when the Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull launched, you'll probably see them be able to package this area of the car so much tighter. This Renault almost, for me personally, looks like, if you look at pictures from a McLaren 2014 car, it looks very, very much like that, the engine cover, where you've got this kind of, the nice Coke bottle shape coming in, and then you've just got this huge tube of bodywork coming through to help cool the car, and it just is a testament to the higher teams that can really get that so much tighter and so much more eloquently done compared to Renault, compared to other teams. And you'll see that learning process, obviously, as you get on, you spend resources, you can work on that area of the car. Obviously for Renault, a team in their position trying to hopefully get up to 6th, 5th in the constructors, they're saying in their press conference, that's not going to be the biggest area for them to improve in the car, obviously not. But eventually, when you get to the top teams, every little detail is going to make that car more efficient. So trying to get that bodywork as neat as you can. Obviously, for someone like for a team like Red Bull in the hands of Adrian Newey, that's going to be just a given that he's going to try and package the car as tight as he wants. Adrian Newey is always known for packaging his cars as tight. We saw in 2014 where they had some overheating issues because the car was so tightly packaged at the rear. But that's been the Renault RS17. I may have missed a few things here and there, but obviously, as I've said in the Sauber video, I'm no expert. I'm just an undergraduate aerospace engineering student, if you're ever wondering, if you're new to the channel. I'm in my final year. I'm doing a dissertation on front wing analysis and the flow over front wings and the wheels for the 2017 cars. So that's why I'm making these sort of videos. So whatever I say, take it with a pinch of salt as well, please. But yeah, for the most part, that's the Renault 2017 analysis from myself. So if you guys didn't enjoy the video and found it somewhat informative, hit that like button. Let me know what you thought again about the Renault car, the livery, or just even if you want to comment on the aerodynamics yourself. And if you're new around here, then do get subscribed, because I'll be hoping to do most of the car launches. I say most. There might be some days where I can't do it on the same day, so I may have to do it on the next day. But the hope is this week I'll be doing all the car launch analysis videos when they come out. So do get subscribed for that. But other than that, I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. Again, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you guys next time.